What you really do is that you talk about the future. You talk about what are you trying to achieve, because what you currently have in the beginning is so shitty that it wasn't worth anything. And you need to find those early adopters that is willing to go on that journey with you. And when I look back, it is so clear who sort of embraced it in the beginning and saw the ultimate potential versus the majority who said, no way.
Welcome to the Freight Debate, the ultimate destination for supply chain professionals, logistics leaders, and anyone who's ever wondered what really keeps the world moving. I'm Phil Hennessey, and today we're talking about the past, the present, and the future of freight, whether that's digital tools, predictive analytics, or new pricing strategies like index-linked contracts and derivatives. What better way to kick off the freight debate and answer those big questions by welcoming Patrik Berglund, co-founder and CEO of Xeneta. You're going to help us break it all down. We'll explore where the industry's been, where it's at, and even have a go at predicting what's next. So, hello, Patrik.
Hey, Phil, that's some big topics that you're outlining.
Well, yeah. Well, I hope you're ready to discuss like pretty much the entire history of shipping in the next 30 minutes.
I'll sure give it my 2 cents.
Good. So just to be clear, when we do a podcast, or when anyone does a podcast, you usually have a producer,
Mhm.
you usually have a pre-meeting, and you usually have a script. We got none of those things, Patrik, because we don't need them. So this is just going to be two guys who love freight talking about freight, and we'll set the world to right. So
That's perfect.
let's kick it off. Let's talk about the past first of all. Best place to start, usually. Co-founder of and CEO of Xeneta. Take us back to 2012.
Yeah.
2012. Yeah, take us back to 2012.
Arguably started even prior to that, right? I think the right place to start is that together with my co-founder, we experienced the problems ourselves firsthand. And if I were to boil it down, it's something along the lines of the ocean freight market being incredibly complex. And it's volatile in terms of pricing, and it's very opaque, not only on pricing, but on a lot of other perimeters as well, time, reliability, capacity, those kind of things. So I think that's the starting point. Operating in a forwarder, Kuehne+Nagel at the time, experiencing these problems and seeing firsthand how difficult that must be for a shipper primarily. Because for a shipper, ocean freight is not necessarily core business. If you're an automotive company, pharma, chemical, whatever it is, ocean freight is a side thing to your main focus as a business. Yet you still need to navigate that market quite frequently, and you need to spend meaningful amounts of dollars to move your product.
Yeah.
And I think being able to see that problem firsthand allowed us to debate why is it like this. And I think the short explanation to that is that it's volatile and opaque because of this volatility, because of the balance between supply and demand, right?
Yeah.
Then the opaqueness is arguably always in the interest of the seller, right? Not
Yeah.
that I think the seller, deliberately thought about it that way, but surely they did not have an incentive to make the market transparent for their customers. In order to create transparency, and this is what we debated, and we ended up with it's a horrible challenge, really, because if you think about the demand side, the shippers, they all hold a little bit of pricing data. So our concept was like in our mind, if we could bring 1,000 of them in the same room, and you would ask them all, what do you pay between Shanghai to Los Angeles? And they would all raise their hand and say, this is what I pay. All of them would be more informed, right?
Yeah.
But legally, you cannot do that, right? But
Sure.
legally, you can source all the data and then aggregate it and create a spread, and you can see yourself in that. That was like this first dream, that if we could get our hands on all of those companies, we could create that beautiful transparency, right? And the more you add, the more frequent data points you would get into the platform, meaning the more of the actual movement of the market as per today, you would actually be able to present to them, right?
Yeah.
But that took so many years, to be
Sure.
honest. It took, I'd say, 6-7 years until we reached a state where I was comfortable that this data is now really statistically sound.
Yeah. So it's interesting that. So you've just kind of fast forwarded 6-7 years, but I'm going to take you back to day one.
Yep.
Before you get 7 years, I'm going to take you back to day one. So there's going to be people listening to this this podcast who may not be actually in the freight industry. They may be tech entrepreneurs. So if we're speaking to those kind of people as well, what do you do on day one? So you sit down with your co-founder, you've got a blank piece of paper. What do you do? What's step one? How do you get? Because everyone has. You used to sit at home, don't you, all the time having big ideas. Oh, what a great idea! No one's ever done that. But it's a big difference between getting out of your head and actually what do you start doing? What do you do?
Yeah, I think it's two things that we did pretty well for a good while. So we first pulled together like an MVP, minimum viable product, like a scrappy version of Xeneta, right? I think it was built in less than 2 weeks. An online sort of portal where you could put in some data and calculate an average. But in parallel to that, from day one, we had an Excel mockup of this concept. So we started calling, emailing whoever we could worldwide that we believed could have ocean freight shipments.
Yeah.
And we used obviously LinkedIn for that. We've even built some LinkedIn scrapers that we had running 24/7. Eventually they blocked us because there was too many profile searches. We had to apologize to get our logins back. And this is a lot of years ago. Now you can approach this in a very structured manner with software that is bolted onto LinkedIn, right? But we kept on grinding it, reaching out and developing that MVP. And what you really do is that you talk about the future. You talk about what are you trying to achieve, because what you currently have in the beginning is so shitty that it wasn't worth anything. And you need to find those early adopters that is willing to go on that journey with you. And when I look back, it is so clear who sort of embraced it in the beginning and saw the ultimate potential versus the majority who said, no way. Even my old colleagues would say you would never be able to get this data at a meaningful amount.
Yeah. Do you have access to that original, very first Xeneta?
I do have some screenshots of the first one, it looks terrible, but the worst thing is that the data behind was so flawed as well. Sometimes because I did the data input together with my co-founder, right? And we kept on doing it ourselves until we were like 5 employees, or at that point, all 5 ingested data, and we couldn't absorb the data we received. It was simply too much Excel sheets and chaos. And sometimes I put in data and let's say it should have been Shanghai to Alaska, and to Oslo, and it ended up to go to Alaska and so forth. So the data quality issues we had in the beginning was also terrible. And then, some people end up using the platform and they reach out and say, hey, I don't understand this. This doesn't look good. And it was, most of the cases, it was errors made on our side.
Great times, though, I imagine.
It was a lot of fun, but it felt like running in a hamster wheel, I would say, for 4 or 5 years, because you got to remember that all the data has a predefined valid from and valid to date. So if you cannot find other companies shipping on the same trades with the same container type, the data lapse. It expires before the user has seen any value.
Yeah.
Right. So in the beginning, your churn rate is so high because you don't provide them with value.
Yeah.
This is why I say it feels like running in a hamster wheel. You just kept on running without really moving forward. But then, as I said, like a few years in, it started to like accumulate to a level where I would say you kind of reach critical mass, and then it's value in the platform, and you start reaching out to people who maybe is more than sort of the early adopters, evangelists that sort of believe in the mission and vision of the company, to more established users who immediately expect to see value. And that was a very rewarding sort of inflection point, I would say.
Let's explore that then. Let's explore reactions. So, reaction when you first, as you and your co-founder with your Excel spreadsheet and your kind of primitive version of Xeneta platform. You mentioned it before, people saying you're never going to do that. Was that the kind of common reaction?
I think more than anything, some of those comments created like almost like a chip on my shoulder, to be honest, because I was way younger as well, but it felt so obvious that this solution should work. So I was willing to work sick amount of hours, to be honest, and put in so much energy and effort that I had never any doubt that it would be possible. Then you can always question whether you're able to do it, right? But personally, I believed we could do that. And then, let's say you get 20 no's and one yes or whatever the ratio is. Once you get those yeses, it fuels you so much,
Yeah.
right? And then when you see the yeses increases or the experience of what you built yourself, I can distinctly remember being in some of these meetings, especially with shipping lines and forwarders who has ocean freight as core business, where I could show them what we built, knowing that it's world class, it's super powerful. And that transition from the early days when I showed them and we all picked it apart and I knew they were right, to being in those meetings saying, no way you can debate whether this price point, who is aggregated from, let's say, 30,000 rates, represents a valid average and spread of the market. And they would, you could see it in their eyes that they would be, yeah, we sit within there. That's how the market has moved. And that sort of satisfaction also fuels you.
Yeah, the hardest nut to crack is probably the most satisfying one to crack as well, isn't it? So the reaction that you got, the kind of negative, or not negative, but the kind of uh, kind of dismissive reaction, was there an part of you, especially when I presume you went to freight forwarders potentially as well, or carriers
Yeah,
potentially as well?
yeah.
Was their reaction, their kind of dismissive reaction, something that you took energy from, or you know?
I think so, because I think my view is that supply will always follow where demand goes. So simplistic analogy would be if everybody wants to buy blue sweaters, nobody's going to produce white, right? Because they're not going to sell anything. And I had the same idea. If everybody wants to use the net as a reference point from the shipper side, eventually supply will follow. And it took 4 or 5 years before the first folders started joining, and then slowly after that, the carriers. And in the beginning, it was, I would, to be completely honest, it was more sort of threatening with lawsuits from the supply side.
Yeah,
And the beautiful thing that I think we realized early is that, you know, it's very hard to fight transparency and visibility. Right? If a seller say that I don't want you to see where the market is, it's basically saying I'm ripping you off, right? So there's no option to fight against visibility, as from my point of view, in the longer run, which means that they need to find out how they can leverage it. And to me, it's always been obvious that if you look at how companies are buying and selling in this industry, it's all based on individual negotiations, one to one, right? And that creates individual outcomes, right? So the perception a lot of big shippers will have is that we have the best possible rates because we're such a power mover. We have enormous volumes, but so does many other companies, and they all individually negotiate. And every time we've proven them wrong, they can be really good, but they're never best in class for all of their trades. It's simply
yeah,
too much complexity,
yeah,
right? So from my point of view, that individual negotiation is extremely flawed because they spend, let's say, 6 months plus minus to run the RFQ. And then the rate they agree is only valid as long as the market doesn't shift too much up or too much down.
yeah,
And decades of this behavior where they, I'm not saying ripping each other off, but they're surely not loyal and sticking to their agreements, one side or the other, depending on where the market goes up or down. This is an incredibly inefficient dynamic in this market.
yeah.
So, from my point of view, I always believe that if we can find demand, accumulate that, supply will follow. If we have the data that is trustworthy and reliable and accurately representing the market, you can change how they buy and sell. And that is equally attractive for the sell side, from my point of view, as it is from the buy side.
Sure, and that's an interesting one, isn't it? In terms of whether they're winners or losers, and it's just the right deal between two parties, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about. But In the early days, I'm presuming you were seen as, I'm not sure whether rebel is the right word, but almost a kind of a
Yeah,
disruptive influence in the market. Did you see yourself as a disruptive influence, or did you see yourself more as a kind of transformer?
yeah. I
You,
I always said we should avoid using the word disruption. It's transportation, global supply chains. They're immensely complex. You cannot do like a booking.com at a meaningful scale for this industry. So I find it insulting to sort of run with that analogy or a comparison. For me, it's been more of a transformative journey for this industry to make their if processes more efficient, more transparent, more data driven. And then obviously, if you talk to the founder and they want to fundraise, then maybe they should use the word disruptive, as investors love it.
yeah, well, I mean, but that's the, you read a lot of kind of scale ups and startups and tech or whatever industry it is, and you're right. Disrupt, ordinarily, if you look up disruptive in the Oxford English Dictionary, it would probably have kind of a lot of negative
Yeah,
connotations. But
yeah.
actually, in this context, usually it's kind of seen in a positive light, as in, you're kind of you're fighting your way to growth, and market share, isn't it? But transformation is just as powerful, isn't it? Is it?
Yeah, but and to be a bit more detailed, I think Airbnb or Spotify, they fundamentally changed their industry in a way where some of the old players can't exist anymore, right? So that's not what we're doing. The existing players will still exist. It's just that their processes will be way more efficient, accurate, and from my point of view, will reduce tons of waste.
Before we've kind of covered the past, but I want to kind of put a little kind of want to underline the past before we move on to the present. And I'll take you back to day one when you sat down with your piece of paper and your kind of primitive version of the Xeneta platform, and then looking back now with all of the kind of hamster, you've been on the hamster wheel for, you know, 13 years. You don't look like you've been on the hamster wheel for 30 years, Patrick. Would you do it all again? Would if you could tell yourself now in 2020 to do it all again?
I think on one side it's tempting to say definitely not. On the other side, I would say for sure I would do it again. Would want to do it way faster, right? So I think you can learn so much from the initial mistakes that we made, right? And the mistakes we've done ever since. And I think it's inevitable that we would make new mistakes, but the better you are at making the mistakes faster and learning at them in shorter cycles, the faster you can move. And I think that's probably what I would have changed. And then I guess the other side of the other thing I would need to consider is whether I would have the energy to stomach the initial phase, right?
Yeah, but you must have grown thick skin over the last,
Yeah,
it's
yeah, you
13
you
years.
sure do. Like you sure do.
But I suppose, if it's the business that you've built up, what you've learned in those early days, presumably you still apply those things that you learned in the ethos of Xeneta. I presume you still applied that ethos, whether it's learning quickly from your mistakes, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That doesn't change, does it?
No, I think no, but you kind of get better at some of these things, I would say, and then you start to trust your gut feeling a bit more every once in a while as well, which I when something is wrong, I tend to go deep and try to intimately understand the root causes for why it goes wrong, right?
Mm.
So, uh, when you're not hitting your numbers or whatever it is, it's like an output you're looking at. What you truly need to understand is why, what is happening that is not producing the right output. And I think that I always think I've had a quite good sort of hunch on these things that
Yeah.
something is wrong. So, and then I think I have a decent ability to go down and look deep to try and understand. And I think those were present back in the days as well, alongside a willingness to, we described this, I remember talking to my co-founder, a willingness to keep on looking until you find the door that is open, right? So whatever problem it is, there is a solution out there. You just got to keep on looking for it.
Yeah.
Um,
Universal truth, that isn't it, really? I think this show is brought to you by Xeneta, the leading ocean and air freight intelligence platform. If you want to stay ahead in an evolving freight landscape, Xeneta provides the data and insights you need to make smarter decisions. Learn more at Xeneta.com. There's the past, done the past, leaving it behind for now, moving on to the present. I mean, we could do a whole kind of podcast series on the present. So can you, I don't know, it's really difficult, but can you kind of give me your thoughts on the current situation in 2025? I know we've got the tariffs and the geopolitical kind of disruptions, but also just as a starting question, we saw COVID back in 2020. That was one kind of, that was one, albeit massive seismic shock to the globe as a, societal and trade. But it's one thing that kind of started and then grew up to a peak and then receded. One thing. And, but we've now had kind of, you can kind of deal with that maybe, eventually. But have we seen, certainly in the past kind of 2 years before, a run? Is it the regularity of the disruptions that are making this such a unique? And I'm not going to use the word unprecedented because it should be banned. Is it the regularity of these disruptions? We've had the Red Sea, we've had port strikes, we've had Baltimore, we've had Trump's tariffs. Now we've got the port fees. There was Panama Canal drought before that. Do you know what? There was there's all these things happening. Is it the volume of these disruptions that are kind of taking this to another stratosphere in terms of challenges for shippers and service providers?
It's a good question. I think if I think about the decade prior to 2020, I surely felt that it was volatile, don't get me wrong, but it was more stable than what we've seen over the past 5, 6 years.
Yeah.
And you could argue whether, the first Trump presidency was the early warning, right? Because then we had a trade war back then as well.
Okay. I was speaking to sorry, Pat. I was speaking to someone yesterday, and I made the point. It's incredible, isn't it? We're kind of reminiscing about gentler times of the first Trump presidency. It's like, back then it was much calmer and gentler times, wasn't it? But it just shows where we are now, doesn't it?
Yeah, two things. So when I think back to COVID, because that was when it hit, it was horrible, right? Nobody knew anything. So I call it like a vacuum period where everybody's just stunned, shocked, holds back, waits, and then see. And what we saw within ocean freight is a massive demand increase, right? Triggered by the fact that people transition their spending from services and travel over to goods, right?
Yeah.
And the subsidies that was injected in the market. And then all of that happened in a market where capacity had been removed in order to tackle what everybody thought initially is going to be a massive sort of contraction. So then everything just exploded, right? What we're seeing now that is similar, I would say, is that vacuum period, uncertainty. But what is different is that every day has something new. And then, as we wrapped up 23 and the market went back to like the old normal, then we had the Red Sea, right?
Yeah.
And whether it's Ukraine or the Red Sea situation or the presidency, or it just feels like a higher frequency of things.
Yeah.
And when you look on the horizon and what's to come, it's hard to believe that it's going to be less. And that feels different to what we sort of dealt with through COVID, both from like that frequency and the future expectations as to what is going to happen. And that's difficult to operate with all that uncertainty.
Yeah.
Right. And it raises questions whether new trade alliances and more different trade patterns are going to be emerging from this. You can see now the reductions in orders into the US, capacity being blanked. Is Europe going to be flooded with cargo?
Yeah.
And capacity going up and more cargo going in that trade? And how will that, on the longer term, if this persists, 5, 10 years, whatever the timeline would be, will that fundamentally change the historical trade patterns that we've seen develop over the past 50 years, right?
Yeah, sure. So that leads us on to another kind of interesting question around how you see the present market, because and in terms of when you start out Xeneta, it was around just the rates, wasn't it? It was how much does it cost to
Yeah.
send this container from here to here. The challenges are becoming more complex, aren't they? So,
Yeah.
when we think about the data that a shipper needs now, whether it's transit time data or kind of the D&D or surcharges or whatever it may be, it just the game has been raised in every way, hasn't it? In terms
Yeah.
of the size of the challenges, but also the information that a shipper or carrier or freight forwarder needs to actually understand it. It's just the world's become more complicated, hasn't it, in freight?
Yeah. And then, which raises an interesting question or a viewpoint from my side. It's like, with all of this data available, it's also more complex to assess all the data and come up with the right decisions for each business. Because I've always said this, that, an automotive or chemical or pharma companies doesn't necessarily have the same considerations as to what is their ideal suppliers for their supply chains, right? And how they weight each one of these perimeters is very different. And then if you, for instance, assess transit time as one of your criteria, let's say you put your high value cargo, so you want to ship the product fast, so you go for a supplier that has one of the lowest transit times they can offer, they will shift their networks soon enough because some of these events that is happening, and they will redeploy the vessels they used to have with the offer they gave you originally. So even that is making it very, very complex to come to the right decisions, even though you have the right data, right?
Yeah.
And without the data, you have nothing, right?
Yeah.
So to me, it's like, yeah, maybe almost like an era of people who's able to crunch and work with data get an upper hand versus the rest.
Yeah. Um, so can you just give us very quickly a bit of insight on you? I know you're CEO, but you still speak to customers. You just got off customer call now, didn't you? But you still speak to customers regularly. What's been the kind of general feedback from the tariffs or the port fees? How are they? What are they doing now? How are you assessing that?
Yeah. So I do try to speak with customers as often as possible. I think I've had 6 or 7 this week already, and it's 3 days into the week because Monday was off. But um, I think there's so many different uh, outcomes so far. We have customers that have canceled orders out of China into the US for months and months to come, massive amounts of volumes. Then we have other companies who've doubled down, actually doubled their weekly volume to move products into the US as fast as they possibly can because they're concerned it's going to be even worse. There's fewer of those in that last bucket, right, than is in the first one, it seems. And then secondly, the appetite to look for alternatives, right, is phenomenal. But a few companies have been scarred from, the first Trump presidency where they actually moved production from China to Vietnam, and then Vietnam gets slapped with a hefty tariff, right? So there is some of this holding period, waiting period now for most, but they're all assessing what are the alternative, not all, a lot of them is assessing what are the alternative supply chains. Could I go from Egypt or Turkey, for instance, into the US? Or how can you bring product from China to Brazil, redo the product, change origin country to bring
Yeah.
it into the US, for instance? We will see all kinds of creative stuff. And this is why I think it's almost fair to compare supply chain and this trade of goods as leaking water. It will find a way. So it's very hard to control this from the US government side, to be honest. And I'm wondering whether one of the main reasons they have to go back to this is simply because it's so hard to
Yeah.
to to fully implement this.
Yeah, but I suppose the water analogy of finding a way is absolutely right, but it will find its way even faster if you put pressure behind it.
Yeah, yeah,
It will find those leaks and it will
yeah,
expose those leaks much
yeah,
faster if you really turn the tap. So I think the tariffs maybe they've turned the tap, haven't they? They put
yeah,
pressure behind it. So if you're a shipper shipping into the US. Previously, if it was say, let's say it was 10% tariff, you go, do you know what? The hassle of sending my goods into Brazil
yeah,
to then repackage them and play this game of compliance and
yeah.
try and kind
That's
of
true.
get around it and
Yeah,
get creative. I can't for 10%. I can't be bothered. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So but if you get north of 100% tariffs, all of a sudden you're turning the tap on that water, aren't you? And you've incentivized them. So now they go, actually, I know it's a right pain in the backside to go into Brazil and do all that stuff, but I'm going to do it because
Yeah.
I have no choice. The game's,
Uh,
as I say, the game's changed, doesn't it?
I 100% agree with you. Got nothing to add. Yeah, it's perfect analogy. I like it.
Ah, well, there you go. During the podcast now. Right. So I think, I mean, we could talk about the present, well, forever, which is a bit
It's
of a,
gonna change tomorrow, though.
yeah, exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
So we'll kind of draw a line under the present. So past done, present done for now,
Mm.
to be revisited, I think. Let's talk about the future. Presumably now you're looking to, in your kind of strategy from the journey from 2012 to 2025, the journey will continue. So, given what we just discussed in terms of the way the world is changing, how are you seeing with the way freight is kind of bought, sold,
Yeah.
negotiated in the coming years?
Yeah, and I think it's important to emphasize that that's like our playing field, right? So there's so much that is constantly changes in this industry. Just look at the development of vessels, right? So it's been formidable innovation and evolution in this industry, right? But on the pure sort of process of buying and selling, it's pretty antiquated if you look at it from a bit of a distance, right? Although there has been developed tender platforms and things like that, in the basic principles, it's still individual negotiations leading to individual outcomes. What I think, and it will still be that, just to be clear, but what I think is a way more effective approach to this, given the volatility of the market and the market dynamic where they remain sort of illoyal to each other depending on the movement, is index regulated contracts. And to me, you can create the same outcome as they've achieved in the past 5, 10 years by constructing the right rule set that adjusts their prices. So you can eliminate the buying and selling process more or less entirely or partially, whatever their strategy is. At least they should look and assess for a certain portion of their volumes or everything, whether they can automate a big piece of this and spend their time elsewhere where the actual effect is of their work is bigger and more impactful.
Yeah.
That being said, I think there will always be a mixture of like companies doing it, let's say, the way it's used to be, to companies really moving into index regulated contracts. And to me, that is more of the transformation. But if we're going to talk about what they're trying to achieve in the old fashioned sort of RFQ, it's to create budget predictability. Indexation of contracts will not solve that, right?
Yeah.
It will create hopefully better partnerships, right? But once you go into a futures market, when you create a financial product where you can hedge your spend and buy futures, that's when you secure the budget. And this is what I think about Xeneta. Like, we've started a journey collecting buyers and sellers on board. We source the data, we provide the insights, and next week we're releasing our first index simulator in the platform, right? Although we have been supporting index regulated deals for a couple of years, but we needed to learn so much before we could actually build the software, productize it, and put it out. So that is, to me, almost like an accumulation of hard work for 30 years and finally seeing it come to fruition from that initial data we sourced to being able to really challenge how this industry buys and sell. And I obviously believe in this, otherwise I wouldn't work on it.
No.
But I've had the same feeling as when we collected data in the beginning and people say you're never going to get enough. This is so obvious it should be working. And this is the same feeling I have for this. It's so obvious.
Yeah. I mean, if maybe it's just a case of, it becomes undeniable. You use the word obvious. You can use the word undeniable, can't you? Because actually, something can be obvious and people deny it.
Yeah.
You can sell something that's unbelievably obvious, and they'll go, "And I don't believe you." And you go,
Yep.
"Hang on a minute, it's obvious." And so, back in 2012, you may have been saying something obvious, but people still went, no, don't believe you, until it gets to the point where it's undeniable, and then
Yeah.
that's where the kind of Xeneta journey gets to. So I think maybe with the whole tariff situation and the complexities and the fact that procurement teams are now stretched, then they're procuring on more trade lanes with more carriers in more ports that they may be not familiar with. It becomes undeniable, doesn't it, that actually
Yeah.
you need to do things differently, and you need to be able to budget, which means derivatives, and you need to use an indexing product because it's undeniable.
Yeah. But we have the reason why I can also trust this so much is that over the last couple of years when we supported this, right, we've moved from like having a few shippers that wanted to dip their toes into this, and we facilitated conversation with the carriers and the forwarders, to now knowing that they do it by themselves. And I think it was last week we learned one of the biggest forwarders struck the biggest index deal they've ever done on Asia to South America with one of the leading carriers. So we know that there is good adoption of this now. We're just facilitating it with an actual product, and then we're going to do contract management, rate management system, all of these builds that naturally fits into this. So for me, I said it, I have no doubt, but the only question is how fast we can drive adoption.
Yeah. Well, we've got, I mean, I'm gonna kind of revert back to the question that I asked you about 30 minutes ago now, whether you'd do it again, and you were kind of umming and ahhing about the hamster wheel and no or yes or no or yes. You clearly would have. there's no way you're gonna that you wouldn't have done that, because I think I think this, whatever the kind of belief was at the start, was so overwhelming that you can't not do it, can you? And I don't believe for a second that you wouldn't have done it if you could tell yourself back in 2012 that you wouldn't.
You might be right. You might be right.
Brilliant. Right. Well, we could talk all day, Patrik, I think, couldn't we? But
Yeah.
as an unstructured, unscripted podcast, I think that was pretty powerful and pretty valuable. We've started in the past and the initial kind of nucleus of Xeneta, growing into what we are today, all the barriers that we've overcome, all the minds that we've changed, all the eyes that we've kind of opened to a new way of working to now. And I think, it's an incredible achievement to go from that primitive version of Xeneta to the platform as we see it today. We've talked about the present and the volatility and the uncertainty and the challenges that our customers are facing, and the future in terms of what's clearly energizing everyone in terms of further new ways of working. So thank you very much, Patrik. Anything else that you want to share?
I think I want to double down that I think I'm most grateful for all the people. Think about all the people of those 13 years who's been involved, and maybe first and foremost all the Xeneta people, right? And even if they were fit or not, I'm so grateful for all the hard work that has been put in. And then secondly, all the partnerships we've been able to struck with all these brands globally, people who decided to believe in us at any stage of the journey. I think maybe that is the most energizing piece of it all, being able to meet all of these people, work together with all of these people, and find those supporters out there that is willing to drive us forward and help us, challenge us, and collectively build what we have today. So when you say it's quite an achievement, I immediately think of all of those people who has helped us achieve this.
Perfectly rounded up, Patrik. Thank you very much. So let's bring this freight debate to a conclusion. Again, I think it's a fantastic episode. I hope our listeners and watchers found it as interesting as we have, and as enjoyable as we have putting it together. So thank you, Patrik. There will be more episodes of the freight debate. So if you enjoyed this one, hit subscribe, join the debate, and let's move the industry forward together. See you on the next one. Thank you.